Welcome to our final panel for this convention, Socialism in the 21st Century, hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society. I will be your moderator for this event. My name is David Fays. This event is part of, and the last event for, the Platypus's 12th annual convention. And the Platypus Affiliated Society was established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism, focus on the problems and tasks inherited from the old left of the 1920s to 1930s, new left of the 1960s to 1970s, and post-political 1980s to 1990s left for the possibilities for emancipatory politics today. We have chapters around the world, from Los Angeles to Leipzig, Austin to Athens, and Chicago to Shanghai. During this current lockdown, we are hosting a number of online reading groups and panel events, such as this one. Starting next week, we are hosting 3 Introduction to Platypus virtual reading groups via Zoom, as well as our regular primary Marxist syllabus in different locations. To find out more about those, you can go to platypus1917.org/virtual, and we'll have a link to that in the chat for your convenience. We also publish a monthly open submission journal, the Platypus Review. The latest issue is number 125, focusing on environmentalism and the left, and is now online, so you should go check it out. If you'd like to submit an article to the Platypus Review, please send an email to editor@platypus1917.org. We'd love to hear from you. You can also check out our podcast, Shit Platypus Says, for your dose of the commentary on the left, which is published regularly on SoundCloud and Apple Podcasts. Please share, subscribe, and give us a review. For tonight's panel, each panelist will have 8 to 10 minutes for opening remarks, and then 3 to 4 minutes to respond to one another. We will then have plenty of time for a Q&A discussion. When we go to the panelists' responses to each other, I will ask you to begin writing your questions. This is for the audience. I'm going to ask the audience to kind of begin formulating their questions for the Q&A box, but to not actually send those in until after the remarks are done. And I'll be reading those out loud for the panelists to respond. And so without any further ado, I want to introduce our panelists and the panel description. So the panel, again, is Socialism in the 21st Century. We have Jamal Abed-Rabbo, who is a member of Chicago DSA and the founder of the DSA Class Unity Caucus. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Chicago. We have Patrick Quinn, who is an archivist at Northwestern University and a member of Solidarity. We have Chris Cutrone, who is a founding member of the Platypus Affiliated Society and is a professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Socialism in the 21st Century.
Oh, and we have Earl.
And we have Earl Silbar now. Sorry. Okay, good. We have Earl Silbar, who I don't have a bio for, but he is a veteran of the new left and was a member of the Students for a Democratic Society and has been very active since then on the left. Earl, if you want me to add any more to that.
That's okay. I was a member of a communist group for 5 years and various other activities down through the years.
Mm-hmm. So, and I appreciate you for stepping on at the last minute here. That's good. Okay, so socialism in the 21st century. In the early 21st century, socialism has been invoked as a defense against neoliberalism by phenomena such as SYRIZA, Podemos, Jeremy Corbyn, and Bernie Sanders. Moreover, the recent polarization of politics, manifested around Jeremy Corbyn and Brexit in the UK, and Bernie Sanders and Trump in the US, has been welcomed variously as a potential opening for emancipatory politics, political engagement, and a renewed imagination of socialism. If socialism has become the goal of the left in the 21st century, what then would be necessary to achieve it? If it has not, what then is the left's goal, and how does it relate to the struggle for socialism? So I was thinking that we could start with Jamal, then go to Patrick, and then Chris. And just for clarification, Earl, are you going to present opening remarks?
No, I just found out 2 minutes ago. I'll just make comments at the end of the speakers.
Okay, so you'll join in at the responses. So the order will be Jamal, Patrick, and then Chris.
Earl, I haven't prepared any remarks either. I'm just going to go off the top of my head. So if you wanted to do that, I'm sure you could pull it off better than I. But thanks for having me again, Platypoids, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. Yesterday's discussion about the American Revolution was pretty stimulating. So I would say with regard to the question, I don't see why socialism shouldn't be the goal of the left in the 21st century. That's a separate question from how we should talk about the goal, but the underlying concept of democratic control of the economy and the means of production, redistribution of wealth, that sort of thing. I don't see why that shouldn't be the goal anymore. But socialism has been discredited in many countries. Perhaps not so much in the United States because it, has not ever actually. We haven't had a major socialist force come to power and then betray its promises in the way that we had in most of the rest of the developed world. But all the same, socialism in the United States has its own quandaries. So if we want to call it something else, if we want to brand ourselves workers' parties or Labor's party or Labor parties or what have you, as socialists have done in the past, obviously I don't see why that should be a problem. I think the main question here is not so much socialism, but socialists, right? How can the American left move past its current class composition, which has formed a sort of political cul-de-sac. And this applies as well to Podemos and Die Linke and the Corbyn faction and Labor and so forth. But sort of divorced from the working class with no organic connection to a thriving labor movement, the left has been captured by professional managerial class, dilettantes and radical activist types, and sort of floundering, downwardly mobile middle-class millennials. This is not a coalition that is capable of forming a broad working class movement to seriously contest power. And the question of how we broaden this movement to include the genuine working class is a very fraught one, because while the socialist movement, the left, is dominated by this sort of alien class, has a sort of alien class predominating composition, that actively keeps the genuine working class out. And it sort of extends its influence into things like the Bernie campaign, for example, we saw where, if Bernie had had his eye on the ball, or if his campaign had had its eye on the ball, they would have been talking about, they would have been making gestures towards being the sort of the big tent candidate on gun control, for example, which is something a lot of people have suggested would have worked really well for Bernie, because it would have allowed him to appeal to a section of the Democratic primary electorate, a largely working class rural section of the Democratic primary electorate that no one else was appealing to. But because they were so obsessed with kind of placating the millennial activists and the sort of progressive types, middle-class progressive types, who probably never constituted the majority of his supporters, but did constitute the majority of his staffers and a very disproportionate share of the people actually out knocking on doors for him and so forth. They kind of, took their eye off the ball, they boxed themselves in, and, they fumbled a perfectly winnable, I think, nomination. And the same thing happened in the UK, obviously, with Corbyn, the refusal to take a principled stand on Brexit, attempting to sell the working class on a rerun of the referendum, in violation of any conception of democratic norms and legitimacy, was a total disaster. And the reason that and I mean, this is something that, Corbyn himself had never been entirely sympathetic to the EU, and it's obvious that if he just had his own way, Labour would have accepted the results of the referendum. But because Momentum and the Corbynite wing of the party were so under the sway of this PMC sort of activist middle class demographic, they felt they had no choice but to take this politically suicidal stance. And you can go down the line, right? You can see what happened to Podemos. You can see what's happened to Die Linke with the hemorrhaging of its support in East Germany. This is kind of, to my mind, the primary issue confronting the left is that we have the wrong class base. How do we escape from it? How do we get out of it? And I don't know, I wish I had answers, but I think at least the first step has to be acknowledging that this is actually what has occurred and what is occurring. With that, I guess I'll yield my time to the next speaker, so we have more time for discussion at the end.
So Patrick, are you able to jump in?
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, I think that in order to understand where we're going in the 21st century, we have to really look backward. We have to take a look at how socialism developed over the past 150 years. We can look at 3 waves of socialism, and we are now at the threshold of the 4th wave of socialism. If we go back to the beginning in the 1840s, we had Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, of course, and we had socialism develop very unevenly in France, and after 1871 in Germany and in England. But it was a mixed bag. And then it was after the Paris Commune of 1871 that you had the development of the Second International. The one formed by Marx and Engels was the first international. You would then have the Second International. And the third major event, of course, was the Russian Revolution of 1917. And that formed the left in the United States for almost a century, from 1917 all the way up to about roughly 1989. You had the left at its greatest apex during that period. The Communist Party in 1940 had 100,000 members. The Trotskyists had about 3,000, and the Social Democrats had thousands of members. But this is a very new period, and it has to be formed by a major event somewhat similar to the ones that formed the other 3 waves of socialism. And so far, that major event has been a rather muted one. It was been the Bernie Sanders campaign for the Democratic presidential candidacy in the United States. But out of that group, out of that campaign came a resurgence in the social democracy. That is, that aspect of socialism which seeks to reform the worst ailments of capitalism. And that's what developed during the most recent period. That is a process that continues to develop. No longer are we at the threshold of 1917. It's a new ball game all the way around. And what we have developing in the United States is a questioning of the ails of capitalism, that most people just work from paycheck to paycheck, from month to month. And the coronavirus crisis has illustrated this quite graphically, showing how difficult it is for most working people in the United States. And this is what's given rise to the Bernie Sanders syndrome. And this is what we will see, I think, during the coming period, that the next period for socialism will be initially that of social democracy. That is, efforts to really reform capitalism to make it less oppressive and continue in that kind of a vein. So we're seeing this not only in the United States, but we're seeing it globally as well. So I'll bring these remarks to a close by simply saying that if we want to understand what socialism in the 21st century is going to be like, we have to look backwards first.
Thank you. Chris?
Okay. Well, last year at the Platypus International Convention closing plenary discussion, I spoke on the issue and problem of redeeming the 20th century. There I commented on the phenomenon of the neo-social democratic and even neo-Stalinist turn of the millennial left in the Bernie Sanders campaign of 2016 and the Jeremy Corbyn-aligned Momentum caucus of the UK Labour Party. I titled my talk, Statism and Anarchy Today, and addressed the phenomenon of socialism and Marxism being mistakenly identified with statism, and freedom being mistakenly identified with the anarchy of capitalism. I have been thinking a lot lately about Karl Popper's liberal open society of freedom and unavoidable risk contra socialism's false and self-defeating promise of security. In previous Platypus Convention talks over the last few years, I've sought to address the problems we inherit from the past 100 years, which I call the century of counter-revolution, following the failure of socialism after the 1917 Russian Revolution. I intended today to elaborate on the difference recognized by original historical Marxism between progressive capitalism and socialism, and to review the history from the late 19th century origins of progressivism up to today. I was going to take the occasion of the impending defeat of Bernie Sanders' primary campaign this year for nomination as Democratic Party candidate for president. But the coronavirus crisis has intervened, rekindling hopes in far-reaching government reforms of capitalism, for instance, seeming to pose the need for Medicare for all, public insurance for healthcare, as well as student loan debt forgiveness, and even a UBI, universal basic income, to deal with the pandemic. Trump and the Republicans he leads, and not only the Democrats, have been alleged to have embraced socialism in the crisis. In the aftermath of the 2016 election and sudden explosion of growth of the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, in response to Trump, I declared the millennial left dead. At the time, it was commented that my declaration was sublimated spleen, repressed melancholy at the losses of the millennial left. Now, regarding the growing wave of disease about to engulf us and desperate attempts to stem the menacing tide of misery from economic and other social devastation and dislocation, I am struck by how the millennial generation has had to endure the worst catastrophes to have occurred during my lifetime. The War on Terror, the Great Recession, and now perhaps the worst plague in more than a century, the gravest scourge since the 1918 Spanish flu. This does not change the verdict of history, which, as the young Nietzsche recognized, is not merciful, let alone sympathetic in its judgments, but is rather relentlessly, ruthlessly critical. As Marx observed in his historical moment, and at his similarly relatively young age of 25 years, it is necessary to be ruthless in the critique of everything existing. As Engels observed, quoting Goethe's Mephistopheles, everything that exists deserves to perish. Is this the perishing that we deserve? In the interest I serve, that Marxism not perish entirely, I want to get back to basics and define the task of socialism properly. This means defining the problem of capitalism properly. First, it is important to address what capitalism is not. It is not greed or profiteering, nor is it exploitation, all recognized sins and crimes in this society. Capitalism is not a social system or moral order or set of values. It is a crisis of the social system, moral order, and set of values. The society we live in is bourgeois society. We live in bourgeois values and morality. Capitalism is the contradiction of that society and its values. And contradiction does not mean hypocrisy. Rosa Luxemburg called capitalism the wage system, and her book masterpiece was on the accumulation of capital. This suggests the problem of capitalism that Marxism thought tasked socialism, namely the crisis of capital accumulation that undermined and destroyed the social value of wage labor. Georg Lukács observed the phenomenon of reification in capitalism and described this, among other things, as a reversal of cause and effect. We commonly identify capitalism with class inequality and hierarchy and its resulting relationships of exploitation. But we are given to think that this is the cause of the problem of capitalism, rather than, as Marxism properly recognized, as the effect of capitalism. For Marxism, after the Industrial Revolution, capitalism exhibits a crisis of the value of labor in social production. But the value of labor, specifically of labor time, is still the measure and still mediates the value of social production in capitalism. In short, and without explaining how this works in Marx's view, it is the self-contradiction of the value of labor time that produces, as a result, the conflict between the value and social right of capital with the social right and value of wage labor. In capitalism, there is a conflict of social rights between labor and capital. But Marxism understood this as a conflict of labor with itself, since capital was nothing but alienated labor. Reification in Lukács's sense meant a reversal of cause and effect, such that capital appeared as a thing separate from labor. But as Nikolai Bukharin put it in the ABC of Communism, capital is not a thing, but a social relation. Specifically, it is the self-contradictory social relation of labor with the means of production, or the contradiction of two aspects of value in social production, capital and labor, namely between past accumulated dead labor and present living labor. The self-undermining and self-destructive character of the disparity between the diminishing value of human labor time in industrial social production and capital as the general social intellect of technique and organization in production and the reproduction of society, what my old professor Moishe Postone described after Marx as the shearing effect and resulting antagonism between labor and the needs of its reproduction and its results and effects in society, has as its expression in the phenomenon of inflation, the necessity of interest and credit, and finance as the necessary form of speculation, namely the claim of the past and the present on the future in investment and production. The result of massive and constantly increasing productivity in industry is the cheapening of labor and thus the cheapening of value. But this cheapening threatens the value of investment and its speculation, hence the crisis of social value in capital. Attempts to preserve value in capital result in accumulation and concentration, producing a separate capitalist class of investors who, in Marx's words, are not rich because they are captains of industry, but rather become captains of industry merely because they are rich. They are capitalists in the sense of not merely owners of capital, but rather are the agents and servants of capital. Capital does not follow the dictates of the capitalists, but the capitalists follow the dictates of capital. Capital is not profiteering, because profiteering is compelled by constantly diminishing value in capital to preserve the value of investment. All production in capitalism is in this sense profit-driven, but not because profit is the goal or the ends of production, but rather because profit is the means by which capital preserves its value. Workers have an interest in the profitability of the capital that employs them to preserve social investment in their work. Marxism thus considered capitalism to be a general social compulsion to produce and preserve value in the form of capital, to which all, everyone, in society is subject. In this sense, everyone in capitalism is a capitalist, namely a follower of capital. And capital does not mean money. Rather, as we already call it human capital, labor itself is a form of capital, and is of course the most important form of capital. Marx called it variable as well as circulating capital. Crises of value in capital characteristically result, as in the recent Great Recession, in the twin phenomena of superfluous labor and superfluous money. Money that cannot find investment as capital, and labor that cannot find employment in social production. This results in the destruction of existing concrete forms of production, the destruction of the concrete manifestations of capital, which means the depreciation of money and the unemployment, starving, and perishing of the workers, the idling of machines and factories, the bankruptcy and dissolution of firms, etc. All of this is to help explain what Marxism originally meant by capitalism being not a social system, but rather a contradiction of the bourgeois social relations by the industrial forces of production. Bourgeois social relations, for instance, private property, meant the social relations of labor. For as we know from the bourgeois revolutionary thinker John Locke, the social rights of property are based in the social rights of labor, namely the self-ownership of the workers to freely dispose of their labor as a commodity, for instance, in the employment contract. For Marxism, industrial production represented the self-contradiction of the social relations of labor. As Marx and Engels put it in the Communist Manifesto, it was capitalism itself which abolished, undermined, and destroyed private property, not only in the form of capital, but also, and most importantly, in the form of labor. Industrial production abolished the value of labor as a commodity. Nonetheless, this constant self-destruction of value was the occasion for its reconstitution and reproduction in different concrete forms after each crisis in value. In short, so long as there were starving workers desperate for employment, the social value of labor would be reconstituted. However, it was subject to self-destruction, restarting the cycle of capital accumulation again. Socialism arose from the perspective of Marxism from this constant self-contradiction, crisis, destruction, and demand for the reconstitution of the social value of labor. As such, socialism was an expression of capitalism, namely an expression of the contradiction of bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production. As the advocacy of the social value of labor, socialism was an expression of the demands of the reconstitution of the bourgeois social rights of labor, namely its social value. All serious thinkers of capitalism have recognized that capital is meant to be a means to the ends of social production, namely of serving and sustaining a society of labor. That capital has reversed this and become an end in itself, and social labor a mere means to capital, this is the perversion that is denounced as capitalism, or the subordination and domination of society to the dictates of capital, to the compulsion to produce, reproduce, and preserve the value of labor, after it has been diminished, undermined, and destroyed by industrial production. In this sense, the task of socialism that Marxism recognized in industrial capitalism already nearly 2 centuries ago remains today. However, the clarity that Marxism achieved about the true nature and hence the purpose or end of this true task of socialism to overcome the social relations of labor has been obscured and lost. Instead, we have at present calls for socialism, as were posed already before Marx and Marxism, by pre-Marxian socialism, more naively and less critically consciously, based on preserving the value of labor. Even calls for UBI, universal basic income, for instance in the recent presidential campaign of Andrew Yang, are based on the social value of labor that fails to find monetary compensation on the market. Socialism today means the state, and hence political management of capitalism, the administrative maintenance of the working class when capital fails to do so. But this means preserving capitalism against its own self-destruction and crisis in social production. Finally, I want to say a note on another way that capitalism is characteristically misrecognized, namely as competition and resulting individualism, including the competition of social groups in capitalism as individuals, for instance, nations and other concrete collectives, hence nationalism and other forms of competitive communitarianism. It is the self-contradiction and crisis of value in labor that drives workers against each other competitively in zero-sum games for survival, rather than, as the original consciousness of bourgeois society recognized, as a function of the development of cooperation. To lose one's job in an obsolescent industry that loses to competition just means switching to a new and different form of employment. This development of social cooperation and production still occurs in capitalism, of course, but it is the tendency of diminishing and self-undermining value of labor in capitalism that renders such development fragmentary and unfulfilled, unnecessarily destructive and wasteful. So individualism and competitiveness is again, not the cause, but rather the effect of the problem of capitalism.
Now, I'm going to ask the speakers to take a minute, like 3 to 4 minutes, to respond to one another. And I wanted to remind the audience at this time to begin formulating your questions so that you're ready to submit them at the end of the responses.
Did you want me to have some comments now or later?
I suppose, yeah, go ahead now since you haven't had a chance.
Well, of all the people I would wish not to follow, Chris would be the first one. That's like a 6-month study guide boiled down. And I was just, a few things caught my attention and we'll see if I got them right. First of all, I think it's really important what Chris emphasized is that competition and individualism is not what capitalism is all about. In fact, you have collective forms of capitalism where the state plays varying roles from small percentage to a very high percentage of the decisions of production. So I think that's an important point that Chris raised. And also that the idea that I think is very widespread is that capitalists run things. I think the image that better fits that is, imagine somebody sitting on top of a wild tiger and trying to hold on, try to maintain their place on top of the tiger and not as the tiger's next meal, because that gets to the point that capital has a life of its own. And I think that's really an important thing to understand, and is helpful in terms of strategies that avoid trying to get good people in positions of authority, thinking that just replacing a set of individuals is going to change the relationships. So I think that was very useful, and I want to tip my hat to it. I'm not sure I followed, and I'm not sure that I agree with the idea that capitalism is not about exploitation. I understand, I think Marx is quite clear, and it's a common understanding, maybe wrong, that exploitation is commonly meant an abusive relationship. But exploitation is simply that the value, the surplus that our labor creates over and above what we need to subsist is not under our control, and is controlled by an alien class that uses it against us to define and defend their own interests. So exploitation, my understanding is exploitation is a daily part of the transaction between workers' labor and dead labor as capital. And let me just catch in a minute here, some scratch notes. It seems to me that the question of socialism, I can't speak to what Chris is saying here. It's too much for me to absorb in one sitting just like that. But I think that the question of socialism, although Patrick sees the widespread demand and desire for reforms of capitalism, which would be social democratic, it seems to me that the situation in the world today is extraordinarily fraught with huge uncertainties and huge changes. Climate change being one, the underlying issues that Chris mentioned about the inability of capital to find investments that get the rate of return that they need. So that's the underlying economic crisis that was waiting to happen and was starting to show itself last fall, and was triggered as an avalanche is triggered by the virus. So we've got the immediate situation of the virus and all the displacement that it causes. We've got the long range and ongoing and immediate devastation from climate change and the worldwide crisis in the capitalist system. So it seems to me that to expect that we're going to have any kind of a long period of looking for social democratic reforms isn't in sync with the magnitude of these crises and what they mean and what they will mean, which means that I think we're going to be seeing the development of forms of struggle and issues being raised with rapidity and that are very profound, and in fact point towards the possibility of a revolutionary break. And we can see that in some ways, for example, with the new wave of worker organizing that we saw a few years back with the West Virginia teachers, who not only incorporated industrial, but had elements of a class program in that they were fighting for and succeeded in getting a 5% raise for all state employees in one of the poorest states in the country. We also see it today with organizing among such people as Google workers about their conditions of employment, but also about the male chauvinism and the sexism that permeates their workplace. So now they're raising social issues that are not directly economic issues. In addition to which, we also see the workers who were being laid off in Lynn, Massachusetts, in a GE plant there, were outside the plant picketing, calling for producing ventilators, not aircraft engines. So they were calling for the use of their labor power for socially useful goals, not connected with profit or the accumulation of value. And these are organic developments. These aren't happening because someone on the left dreamed them up or thought it would be a good idea. They're organic developments in the class struggle. And I think they point towards potential for revolutionary break, which it seems to me is the main goal should be to understand and help prepare for that and do what we were told to do by Mr. Marx, who said that we should be, what's the word?
Organized.
No, it's what you do when a baby's coming.
Perform the midwife.
Yeah, be a good midwife to revolution. I'll stop there.
So who wants to jump in with remarks? Jamal?
Well, sure, if you want to call on me. I think that the question of forming ourselves into a midwife for revolution or for, you know, at the very least, a social democratic shift in the electoral system. I mean, those are the two poles of what we can hope to achieve, and neither one of them, honestly, we're in any state to accomplish at the present. I mean, that's the central question, right? And so I appreciate Earl's comment in that respect, but I do want to kind of, because I've heard a lot of this about how, you know, this upsurge in union activity and so forth is kind of pointing, you know, the way forward, and absolutely what the West Virginia teachers were able to accomplish. And what teachers have been able to accomplish in many cities and states around the country is extremely impressive, and something that we should applaud and try to help along as much as we're able. But, you know, a 5% increase in wages across the board, I don't think points to a revolutionary break. I don't think that Google workers organizing around sort of middle class politeness concerns in their workplaces really points to revolutionary break. So I am sort of just thinking through how, you know, how we can on the one hand say that, you know, these little, you know, movements that are kind of popping up point to a revolutionary break, and on the other hand say that, you know, we can't, and I'm not sure that Earl was saying this, but I've heard it said many a time that, you know, social democracy, we can't even be thinking about that. It's the present circumstances are far too urgent. We need something far beyond social democracy and so on and so forth, when the very signs that people sometimes allude to as indicating, oh, we might, you know, they look like social democratic signs to me. A 5% raise in wages across the board is a social democratic sign, right? It's not a revolutionary sign. So I don't know, that just kind of is what sprung to my mind.
Patrick?
I think that that really Earl does raise some very important issues that have to be addressed. I think that in the coming period that we will see a combination of social democracy, that in other words, something that's impelled by the need to reform capitalism. But at the same time, you're going to find concurrently a disillusion with capitalism as a system, and that an inclination that capitalism has to be replaced as a system. It's a failed system. And I think that that kind of combination of political developments is something that we're going to see move forward as we get into the 2080s. It's going to be a very uneven process. It's going to be fraught with dispute and you know, contradictions, but it's nonetheless going to occur, in my opinion.
Chris, did you want to respond?
Yeah, a couple of things. So, as I said in my opening remarks, I originally intended to review the difference between progressive capitalism and socialism. And of course, social democracy would be a form of progressive capitalism. I would put that out there to discuss what it means to talk about socialism in the 21st century versus socialism in the 20th century, because I think that the struggle for socialism in the 20th century essentially got subordinated to the struggle for progressive capitalism. And that was always a danger that was recognized for instance, in the late 19th century. So Patrick raised the 4 phases of socialism. The first 3 basically taking us into the 20th century, and the 4th one being the current kind of circulation of this idea of socialism. And I would say that what makes the current phase, of course, very different from the preceding 3 is precisely the identification of socialism with progressive capitalism and with social democracy. Social democracy as understood, especially after World War II, I would say. You could say that after World War I, the splitting of Marxism into social democrats versus communists, I would argue that the social democrats after World War I were still pursuing socialism. The original idea, the original Marxist idea of socialism, but they disputed with the communists the means to that end, not the goal, but rather just the way of getting there politically. And whereas after World War II, I would say that social democracy becomes part of the global New Deal, which is very different. In other words, that's where you really have the collapse of social democracy into progressive capitalism. And so we have to kind of attend to that. So I would, say that that 3rd wave, if you will, the post-Russian Revolution 3rd wave of the struggle for socialism, really collapsed a long time before 1989. And I think that's important in thinking about, where we are historically with this question. And it also goes to why this 4th wave of socialism that we might be experiencing historically is so very different than the preceding ones.
All right, so at this point, unless there's any further comments that you guys want to have with each other, I think we can open it up to the audience to ask some questions.
Could I have 60 seconds to respond to what Chris just raised?
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
I don't think we've really said what we think socialism was originally, or at least Marxist socialism. And I would just like to throw in that I think what's extremely relevant, what's pertinent, and what is necessary, and what is coming in the future is the need to end our exploitation as a system, because the accrual of capital comes from exploitation of surplus value from our wage labor, so to speak. And Marx, I think it's in volume 1, chapter 1, not to be too academic about this, but Marx points to the end of alienated labor through what he called freely associated labor, which is a different concept, and which, in my belief and my looking at the experience of social democrats governments such as Allende in Chile in 70 to 73, is that the social democratic movement and ideas and goals and methods cannot bring us to that break where we can have freely associated labor and act as an impediment to it. And therefore, just accepting that social democracy is on the agenda gives up what I believe is the necessary fight to show, to share, and to expose and build an alternative that prepares for a rupture that can lead us in this new direction.
I suppose maybe just quickly I'll say one thing, which is I think that what Earl and I are addressing through different terms is actually the same thing. In other words, overcoming alienated labor, it means overcoming the general social compulsion that motivates, that drives exploitation. In other words, freely associated producers, yes. And certainly that would characterize what we can envision of a post-capitalist society. But we're really talking about overcoming the capital value compulsion dynamic that drives it all. And so I would say that, we kind of agree more fundamentally, but use somewhat different terms. In other words, I think that the term exploitation is very loaded. And as I said, it's already recognized as a sin and a crime in the society. And therefore, we do have to think about, especially because things are so nationalistic, right? In other words, that if, a country, a highly developed industrial country that adopts social democracy still exploits the rest of the world, right? Still kind of participates in the value dynamic of capital at a global scale. And the 20th century obviously demonstrates that to a great degree, but not because people are particularly interested in being ruthless or greedy or anything like that, right? It's a kind of a structural issue. And that's important to at least have in the back of our minds. In other words, that's not an agitational kind of slogan. That's not a way that you can agitate. And it's barely something that you can propagandize around. But it's something that we have to keep in the back of our heads, because I think that that's really been lost in favor of socialists are egalitarian, socialists are about social solidarity, they're about a kind of community collective spirit, whereas the capitalists are individual, greedy, competitive, ruthless exploiters. And as long as that idea really dominates among the cadre, if you will, right? In other words, we're not talking about the way people in the masses think about it, because they probably think all sorts of different things about capitalism. But the socialists, right, the socialist left, the people who call themselves socialists, the degree to which they think that that's the problem with capitalism, we're going to be here forever. No matter what catastrophes strike the earth, capitalism will continue.
Until the fall of civilization.
Yeah.
So, all right, I think we can open this up to some questions from the audience then. Okay. So there's a few questions on Stack, and again, keep them coming in. This first question is from Susie V. Susie says, I feel that to a certain extent, what Patrick and Earl have identified is a similar political atmosphere to that of the New Left of the 1960s. A lot of leftists, a potential for a revolutionary break, but each movement that these leftists manifest evaporates as soon as it emerges. Contrary to this, the Russian and German revolutions of 1917 to 1918 were understood to be the products of the socialist parties of those countries self-consciously organizing the workers to further the contradictions of capital in an attempt to push them beyond themselves. This being the basis for a socialist revolution. If, as Chris has identified, the millennials have suffered some of the worst global tragedies in recent history, how has this been registered absent of a socialist party? And what could be said of the failure of the 20th century to produce a socialist party, especially in America, capable of organizing workers' attempts to navigate these crises politically? I think that's to all panelists.
Too much for me to digest and respond to this quickly. I'm sorry.
I'll take a stab at the last bit about the failure of the 20th century to produce a socialist party in America. So the United States did produce a socialist party of considerable scope, the Socialist Party of Eugene Debs, and then it produced a Communist Party of considerable scope shortly thereafter. Both of those parties collapsed. They were pushed over the brink, obviously, by the Red Scare, by government crackdowns, but fundamentally, this is sort of my hobby horse, so you'll forgive me, but the American political system, the electoral arrangement, is particularly dangerous for left parties, because at a certain point, they have to make the choice of, are we willing to compromise with left liberal, social democratic currents within one of the two major parties in order to mitigate the catastrophic harm of the further right of the two major parties winning, right? And invariably they wind up either as parties or as voters, members of those parties wind up compromising. And so this is why I think that when we look at what has occurred in the United States, what sets it apart from other developed countries in the absence of the formation of a mass labor, social democratic, workers' party, whatever, we can't separate this from the way the electoral system and our political institutions are arranged, and we have to start thinking about ways of reforming those in order to clear the space for such a party to emerge.
If I might, I will just offer that I think the task for socialism in the United States is not particularly different from elsewhere. In other words, elsewhere in the other developed capitalist countries, as well as around the world in all countries, you often do have labor parties, workers' parties, social democratic parties. And I would say the task in those countries is pretty much the same as it is here. And that task is really outside the electoral arena. Meaning, I think that electoral politics, electoral campaigns might have a role to play, but really one of the things that, and one of the reasons why I declared the millennial left dead with the Bernie campaign, is that it identified the struggle for socialism with trying to change the Democratic Party, and that the real bump didn't come from the Bernie campaign itself, but rather from Trump's election. In other words, it was a reaction to Trump. And I would say that rather, the struggle for socialism, to build a socialist party, is independent of whoever is elected and independent of government policy, administrative policy, government, and also independent of the law, independent of the laws that are on the books, meaning the task remains the same, whether it's legal or illegal, whether conditions are favorable or unfavorable at the level of capitalist politics. That the task of building a socialist party is not primarily electoral. I think that's pretty clear with the examples that Jamal raised about the Socialist Party of America before World War I and the Communist Party, USA, after World War I. Debs, of course, is known for running for president and getting a fair number of votes, but the real activity of the Socialist Party of America, as well as more obviously with the Communist Party USA, was not electoral, and I'm talking about before the Communist Party subordinated itself to FDR's New Deal. In other words, if you look at the Communist Party in the 20s and in the early 30s, they initially denounced FDR and denounced the New Deal as fascist. Even before they subordinated themselves to the Democratic Party, to the New Deal, their activity was primarily non-electoral. And that's not due to illegalization, criminalization of communism or government repression or anything else. It's because that's where the action has to be. The action has to be at the level of social organizing, civil society, we would call it. And you had this in the DSA between 2016 and 2020. You did have some agitation in the DSA for so-called base building and for what was called building proletarian civil society. Now, I agree with that without necessarily agreeing with all the assumptions that might have gone into that for the people who formulated it. But in broad terms, I think that that is the task. And that's the task faced by socialists in every country in the world. It's not fundamentally different because the US doesn't have a Labor Party or a Workers' Party or a Social Democratic Party. And indeed, that task is posed even more sharply in countries that do have capitalist labor parties and capitalist social democratic and socialist parties. And we should also add capitalist communist parties, right? Let's not forget that communist parties have been part of capitalist politics for a good long time now. Patrick has to unmute.
Yeah. Oh, Patrick, could you unmute yourself? Yep.
Yes, I assume that you're speaking, Christopher, about the Communist Party's turn from the 1930s to the 1940s.
Yeah.
And of course, in the 1930s, the CP in the United States was primarily ultra-left. It was outside of the mainstream of any kind of organizational politics. But then, under the Popular Front regime, as depicted by Stalin, it made a turn to Rooseveltian Democrat, the Rooseveltian democracy. And that's where the CP threw all of its eggs into the basket under Earl Browder during that period. And so what we see today is that primarily the Social Democrats, including Bernie Sanders, who incidentally started as a Trotskyist at the University of Chicago, that Bernie Sanders looks back, harkens back to the Rooseveltian democracy as the most left-wing expression of an antidote to capitalism. And that's basically where we see ourselves today, that it's a restorationist of the Rooseveltian democracy, which incidentally it's pushed far to the left, beyond anything that Roosevelt wanted by external forces. So we're seeing that situation today, and what we're seeing is that people see today no alternative. That there's really no alternative to reforming capitalism, and there's no alternative that would entail replacing capitalism as a social economic system.
So this next question is first for Earl. What do you make of the rejection of the old left in the 50s and 60s by the new left? And does this mark a break in the 1917 to 1989 era that you described? And then there's a second question tacked onto that that's more broadly to all the participants. Do the current rejections of the new left views of, for example, identity politics becoming passé, point to a revitalized socialist movement or a further burying of historical experience?
Could you repeat that question to me, please?
Yeah, so the first was, what do you think of the rejection of the old left in the 1950s and 1960s? Did that mark a break within that 1917 to 1989 era that was described? And then more broadly to all the participants, does the current rejection of the new left today, like for instance, in people thinking that identity politics has become passé, does that point to a revitalized socialist movement, or is that a further burying of historical experience?
So let me try and respond to the part of the question that was directed to me.
Oh, just sorry. There was a quick clarification from the person who asked. They actually meant that for Patrick. Although, of course, Earl, you can feel free to respond as well, of course.
Because we're of the same generation, no problem. Go ahead, Patrick.
No, Earl, you go first, because we may have different interpretations of this particular response.
Shocking.
I will
shocking,
say,
Patrick.
Pardon?
That's just shocking that we could have a different point of view. So, despite the appearances, that's a good question. I don't think it really was the kind of break that it appeared to be. It was an organizational break in the sense that the CP was much less of a factor. But the fact is, well, my read of it, and I, of course, was part of it because I joined a Maoist organization, Progressive Labor Party, in the late 60s. There was not a complete break. As a matter of fact, I would say that's one of the reasons that we failed to leave a better situation for the young people today. There was not a complete break because a lot of it, at least from the people who thought of themselves as revolutionaries in SNCC and SDS and Progressive Labor and new parties, was that we did not examine the roots of our politics in the communist movement. So even where the Chinese were leading rhetorically against the Russian line of peaceful coexistence and peaceful transition to socialism, there was never an examination of the roots of the politics of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and its affiliated organizations. And so I think we tried to reconstitute it, but based on unexamined and partially poisoned heritage, which basically did us in. And I'll leave it at that. If anybody wants more, that's fine. And I think that's true for the Trotskyists, but I'll leave that to my friend.
Well, the Trotskyists were never that large. Maoism was the largest political current, as you know, Earl, that came out of the 1960s. And Maoism has its origin in Stalinism,
Sure.
by and large. So what happened so much was not a rejection per se of the New Left, because the New Left really very quickly after 1968 deteriorated into the Progressive Labor Party on one side and the various Maoist organizations on the other side, the Klonskyites and Bob Avakian and those sorts of people. But the real New Left of the early SDS was never ultimately rejected per se. It was bypassed, I would argue, in that instance. So perhaps Earl would have a different perspective on that, but I would say that the New Left of the 60s was never ultimately rejected.
May I just say something? So originally, Patrick, when you were laying out the 4 waves of socialism historically, I thought you would include the New Left, and you didn't, and that sort of surprised me. And so, when you said 4 waves, I thought, okay, in my head, I kind of lined it up so that the New Left would be one of them.
Christopher, I said 4 waves of socialism. The New Left was modestly socialist.
Mostly anti-imperialist.
Right. So, but let me say something else about the current DSA, right? So what's been interesting to me is how the historical origins of the DSA have been kind of turned over a little bit, and people have tried to investigate those origins to a certain degree, but to my mind have missed out a great deal of the substance of it. So of course, Michael Harrington was a kind of Trotskyisant kind of, you could, certainly Stalinists would call him a Trotskyist. He was a Shachtmanite. And out of the old Socialist Party of America, which fostered the early SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, and ultimately founded the DSA on the other side of the New Left experience. So Michael Harrington as a kind of an early New Leftist, but also as someone who leaves this legacy of the New Left in the 80s that has been taken up now, and that seems to kind of skirt a lot of the issues of the New Left per se. However, the DSA was formed out of 2 separate tendencies. One was the Social Democratic organizing committee that came out of the Socialist Party of America. It split. But the other was the New America movement, which also had some shared background with Maoism, with the Maoism of the New Left. And by 1982, they formed the DSA. Now, what's interesting is how the earlier Socialist Party of America, the Harrington, Max Shachtman, and Bayard Rustin perspective in the 60s on trying to realign the Democratic Party has been misremembered, to my mind, today. In other words, that people have sort of taken that up as if that's a kind of outstanding, lingering task from history that now the millennials have tried to engage, but with an important kind of lacuna in that, which is that they forget that the realignment strategy that Shachtman and Harrington and Rustin had was not to turn the Democratic Party into a socialist party or even into a social democratic party, but rather to turn it into what they call the Black and Labor Party, and to basically smash the New Deal coalition, to get the Dixiecrats out of the Democratic Party and to put them in their more natural home in the Republican Party. The point of them doing that was not because they hoped to achieve socialism through the Democratic Party. It was actually to make room for a socialist party to reemerge. In other words, what the alignment strategy was meant to do was recreate the situation of pre-World War I American politics, where the Republicans were the kind of representatives of the haute bourgeoisie, the high capitalists, and the Democrats were the representatives of the middle class, and then the Socialist Party would become the representatives of the working class in the struggle for socialism. But they had this kind of idea of a midpoint in that process, which would be to fracture the New Deal coalition and realign capitalist politics to make things more propitious for socialism. What happened instead, of course, is the Southern strategy of Nixon and Reagan. In other words, the New Deal coalition was smashed, and the Dixiecrats did go over to the Republican Party, but this did not create conditions for the emergence of a socialist party. It didn't realign capitalist politics in a way more favorable, because it had to do with Max Shachtman's bureaucratic collectivism thesis and the way he thought the New Deal had repressed the working class in a particular way. Right, the managerial revolution, that it had kind of hijacked the working class and left no room for there to really be a proletarian socialist politics, so long as that was the case. And so, again, now it's taken up as a kind of, well, let's fulfill what Shachtman and Harrington and Rustin wanted to do in the 60s. And so in that way, there's an interesting memory of the New Left, although it's not the memory of the New Left that most people have. Right, most people's memory of the New Left is new social movements, anti-imperialism, race, gender, and sexuality, so-called identity politics, PC, and neglect that there was an actual crisis of the New Deal coalition, as well as a crisis of the old left, a crisis of the old Stalinist left that Earl referred to, that generated things like New Left Maoism, and also, by the way, gave Trotskyism a new lease on life. Even if as a minority tendency of the New Left, still Trotskyism did make something of a comeback through the New Left. So I think what's interesting about the DSA phenomenon today is how they misremember that history. But even in that misremembering, there's something of the 60s moment that comes through in a kind of distorted way, however. But again, and Maoists, anti-imperialists, Trotskyists would have regarded Harrington and Shachtman and Rustin as social democrats in the pejorative sense, and would have perhaps neglected what their actual goals were. In other words, that they were kind of hunkered down under this New Deal coalition circumstance, and they were ensconced in the labor movement. But they thought they were biding their time until the crisis of that New Deal coalition could be turned in a different direction. That crisis did turn things, but it turned things towards neoliberalism and towards the new right.
Can I add 30 seconds to what Chris said? Since
Well, yeah, go ahead, Earl.
Put me on a timer. Chris, I was in the Socialist Party, Social Democratic Federation. I was in YPSL, which in the most right-wing realignment section in Boulder in 61, 62, 63. We never, ever discussed breaking up the New Deal coalition. It was definitely to get the Dixiecrat racists out of the Democratic Party, but it was to make it what might be called a populist party or a party of the people. And I don't remember any discussion. I was a delegate to all of our conventions. There was no argumentation that this had anything to do with it. It may be that it was in the writings of Harrington or something like that, but it never got boiled down into the actual reality that I experienced in YPSL and Socialist Party.
Can I ask Earl just quickly, how was this understood as furthering the goals of socialism at the time?
We used to joke the only thing read about us was our membership card. Not at all would be my answer, Chris.
Really?
Really.
So you don't think Harrington and Rustin and even Shachtman still
Now wait,
socialists?
I'm just speaking for the realignment tendency. There was also a Labor Party tendency who were our declared ultra-left enemies, so I can't speak for them too well.
Okay, all right.
Let me raise a couple of issues.
Okay.
Slightly different than those that were raises. Let's make no mistake about it. Max Shachtman was moving to the right. He was really in the middle, the mainstream of the Democratic Party by the end of the 1950s. And what was opposed to Max Shachtman and Bayard Rustin and the other people who were moving to the right, which was presaged, incidentally, by James Burnham, the author of Managerial Revolution, much earlier, moved to the right much earlier than Shachtman did. But as in opposition to the Shachtmanites, that two Trotskyists, Hal Draper and Joel Geyer, founded the International Socialist Clubs on the West Coast in Berkeley, which became the IS, the International Socialists, which was the forerunner of Solidarity, the organization that I belong to.
They were the independent socialists first, though, right? Before they were the international socialists? Didn't they call themselves independent socialists?
Yes, that's correct.
Go ahead.
That is correct. They were based primarily in Berkeley. And then after they developed into the IS, they decided to move into the industrial Midwest. And they transferred most of their membership from the West Coast into factories in Gary, Indiana, Detroit, Michigan, and along the shores of Lake Michigan.
So I'd like to jump in quickly. And I do think that there is a conception that the DSA, the millennial DSA, is straightforwardly realignist. I think that in actual practice, it may behave that way a lot of the time, and many people are probably realionists in their heart of hearts, but the way that people conceptualize what they're doing doesn't tend to be realionist. It tends to be dirty break. We're going to opportunistically engage in Democratic Party politics with the hope that this will heighten some tensions and we'll be able to split off into an independent party. And I want to address the second part of this question, which was, do current rejections of new left views, identity politics as the example, point to a revitalized socialist movement? I would say 2 points. One, we have to talk about who is doing the rejection, right? Identity politics has been rejected by the actually existing working class and the broad population since its inception, right? This has never been accepted by anyone outside of the left. It's a wildly unpopular sort of set of ideas. Now, the fact that you have some people on the left, myself included, criticizing it and maybe getting a little bit more airtime and maybe some think pieces going on, blah, blah, blah. I mean, sure, that's healthy. That's better than nothing, right? But I think let's not kid ourselves that within the actually existing American left, identity politics is becoming passé. I think the actually existing American left is going to be clinging to identity politics, screeching, before it gives it up. And this is why, to me, it's very important that we recognize that the actually existing American left is not much of a left, right? If we want to form a left, we're going to have to find a base in the actual working class to constitute the nucleus of that left. It's not going to be the DSA. It's certainly not going to be any of the smaller sort of ultra-left post-Trotskyist parties floating around, maybe potentially Socialist Alternative excluded because they actually accomplish things. So that would be my response to that part of the question.
Good.
If I can make an interjection here, that what we haven't discussed today is the demise of the largest organization on the left.
ISO.
Here of the ISO, the International Socialist Organization, which had up to 3,000 members, and then all of a sudden voted to dissolve and disappeared from the political landscape. Now, some of these ex-ISOers are in DSA now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a member of DSA, although I don't come from that tradition. But they still constitute a possibility of regrouping the American left today. And there are various currents out there, including the former leadership current of the ISO, which is still extant and is trying to regroup people around itself. They still hold the largest socialist organizational endeavor in the United States today. That is Socialism, would be Socialism 2020 in Chicago, where thousands upon thousands of people attend and participate in that. And we should keep that in mind as an important component of regrouping of the American left today in 2020.
So this next question is from Tom Cannell, and it's kind of divided up into like specifically for each panelist, but it's broadly about the question of class struggle. So for Chris, does your understanding of capitalism require reconsideration of what we mean by class struggle? For Jamal, does the subordination of the left to the professional managerial class, so to speak, require us to reconsider the left's relationship to class struggle? And for Patrick and Earl, do changes in the economic structures, such as deindustrialization, require a reconsideration of how we think of class struggle?
So let me just, I'll respond quickly to that. I think class struggle is a very tricky category and has really become eccentric in its meaning from the original Marxist understanding. So I would say that really when we're talking about class struggle, it should not be understood first and foremost as vis-a-vis the capitalists. In other words, I would say that where we're at now, it's really about the independence of the working class. In other words, the working class building up its own organizations and establishing social and political power of its own. And the degree to which the capitalists and capitalist politicians are obstacles to that, then of course there will be struggle, right? But I think that the problem is that nowadays, the idea is that class struggle means the grievances and the demands that the workers make of the capitalists and of their politicians. And I don't think that's the way to approach it at all. I think it's actually the exact backward way to approach it. I think that the task of the working class is to constitute itself, and that it doesn't constitute itself through appeals to the capitalist class or its politicians. It does the opposite of constituting itself that way.
To respond to my section of the question, which is about the subordination of the left to PMC influence, I don't think this is going to actually respond to that in a way that's satisfactory to Tom, but it is a point that I want to make nonetheless. I'm sorry, Tom. I don't think that the PMC domination of the DSA in particular was a foregone conclusion, or perhaps the domination was a foregone conclusion, but the hegemony that we currently see of professional managerial class politics in the DSA was not a foregone conclusion. That occurred in large part due to the split and rat fucking of the String Caucus, and that basically demoralized and forced into submission the elements of the DSA that had a genuinely working class oriented politics. So I think that the fact that we lost that fight in the DSA, and we may well lose it in whatever organization comes next, doesn't mean that we should give up on the possibility of creating a current within the American left that has a genuine orientation towards the working class. And I think that you can look at individual DSA chapters, in particular Philadelphia, which I think is probably one of the most admirable left political groups in the country right now. Philadelphia DSA has, I think, a politics that is much more oriented towards the working class than the rest of the organization. So I would say that insofar as we have to reconsider the left's relationship to struggle, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We should, try to form a left that is capable of engaging in class struggle in a meaningful way, rather than
Jamal, can I just ask you to clarify and just explain a little bit the Spring Caucus and the rat fucking that they were subject to? I have in mind one particular member who was also a member of Socialist Alternative, if I'm not mistaken, who was kind of run out of DSA on sexual assault charges that seemed bogus. Is that what you're talking about?
No, actually, that's not. I'm not actually familiar with the case that you're alluding to. So the Spring Caucus was the Marxist caucus that was supposed to form in January 2019. It did briefly form, but it immediately collapsed within a month and a half or so. And it collapsed because there were two major wings to this caucus. One of them was the wing oriented around Philadelphia and, to a certain extent, certain people in New York, certain people in Phoenix, elsewhere in the country, in DSA. This had what I guess you could call, I mean, they're, sort of Adolf Reed, Cedric Johnson style approach to class politics, and kind of more sympathy, I guess maybe sort of left populist sympathy.
Are they around the Philly Socialists?
No, they hate Philly Socialists. So they're
damn.
Right.
Okay,
so
well, that's a problem right there.
So Philly Momentum, which is the local caucus in Philly, and Philly Socialists don't get along. Philly Socialists, to my understanding, is sort of a anarcho-liberal base builder cohort. And the other wing of the Spring Caucus, which is currently the Bread and Roses Caucus, lots of ex-ISO people, lots of sort of low-level Jacobin staffers, that sort of thing. The basic cause for the split was that the Bread and Roses wing didn't like the Philly wing's insistence on kind of a class first framing. And when it became apparent that this was going to be a liability for them going into the convention because people were going to call them Strasserites on Twitter or whatever it was they were afraid of, they basically organized a purge of the Philadelphia wing of the caucus, split it in half, and refounded it as Bread and Roses. So since then, Bread and Roses has been the kind of post-ISO kind of identitarian sympathetic caucus in the DSA, and the Philly wing has kind of been licking its wounds and hasn't been organizing at the level of the entire organization. So I hope that kind of explains what happened there.
I, for one, of course, do not mourn the ISO exactly. I would say that it's unfortunate how things went the way they went, but yeah.
So there was just one last part of that question for Earl and Patrick. I think Patrick dropped out for a second. But I want to take a stab at that.
So the question is, have the changes in the economy led to different attributes of class struggle, different forms of class struggle? Is that the question?
Does it require a reconsideration of how we think of class struggle?
Yeah. Well, I think to some extent, yes. If people are tied to the idea that class struggle has to operate in big factories and it has to be around economic demands, then I would say absolutely yes. But I don't know how widely that's understood. My guess from touching the waters in the Bernie campaign and going out on my block one Sunday afternoon to talk to people, as well as personal conversations, my guess is there's a wider understanding of the working class as everybody who's got to work for bosses or go to work for somebody else. And so I would say no, but there are obviously different forms. For example, I was startled to find out that there was a significant number, I think they were Uber drivers, in a common demonstration with taxi drivers in New York City. So the fight to be recognized as workers and to gain the right as workers is something that's what exists in the gig economy that is new. It doesn't have to be recognized legally or in struggle. So, but their elements are still similar. People have to come together and form some kind of collective, even if it's a half a dozen people at an Amazon warehouse. And yeah, I think the similarity is still there, is to say we're workers. But there are lots of people in gig economy who are very content to be able to choose the time what they work and when they work. So that's a new development. And that's all I would say about that.
A follow-up question from the audience. How does the working class constitute itself without socialists? Like, how could you have class struggle without socialists?
That's to all of us, I assume, right?
I think so, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I would say, I've written about this, kind of rather sharply, I would say, in the sense of being angular about it, that without the goal of socialism, there really isn't class struggle. Now, of course, that's an extreme statement to make, but it's to emphasize that at least Marx thought, and of course, based on his own historical reality, he had some reason to believe this, that the working class only really constituted itself as such.
In the party.
Yeah, in the party, in forming itself as a political force.
Yep.
And so, now that, seems to put the cart before the horse, so to speak. And yet, that was the understanding that Marx had. I mean, of course, the reason for that is that Marx didn't invent socialism or communism. Marx and Engels arrived rather late on the scene. There's already a well-established mass movement among the working class for socialism in the advanced capitalist countries by the time Marx and Engels arrive. And so they could have that assumption. And that remained the case even after the defeats of 1848. The defeats of 1848 did not dissolve the existing organic working class struggle for socialism that had already constituted itself as a political force. So the Chartists in England are the one main example, but also socialist tendencies in France and Germany and other countries.
Would you include the Communist League?
Certainly, of course, yeah. I would, and I would say that right. The fact that they commissioned Marx and Engels to write the manifesto, I think that the Communist League got more than they bargained for in that, right? Not to say that 1848 wasn't a crisis for the socialist movement, it was, but still, throughout Marx and Engels' lifetime, there was an already constituted working class force, struggling for socialism in a way that I don't think exists today and hasn't existed for quite some time.
So there's another follow-up on this discussion about labor organizing in particular, and how does labor organizing play a role in constituting the working class? If anyone wants to take a stab on that.
I would say it's a big part. I would say it's a big part. My personal experience is in factories where we were organizing in-plant committees to organize unions, or where we had a union to try and find other like-minded rebels and left revolutionary types who wanted to organize ourselves as a teacher, as an adjunct faculty, constituting ourselves as a workforce meant that we were taking a step beyond our own classroom. We were saying, we have to change the conditions of our existence here. To what extent? That was another question. So I think it's a fundamental part of recognizing yourself as having the possibility of being a force that can make change based on your commonality as workers. So to that extent, I think the answer is yes, even though the conditions are different. And just to illustrate, I mean, there are something like 2 billion people in the proletariat worldwide, according to the
OECD.
Pardon?
OECD.
Actually, it's the international. Is it called the International Labor Organization? It's of the United Nations.
Right.
And their figures. I gave a talk at the Open University to the left on the precariat, and there were 2 billion, and a steadily rising curve. Doesn't promise it'll stay that. So my only point is there are different forms of organization and struggles to organize, everywhere. And of course, it's meeting resistance. And it's been very widespread. And there was a big upsurge in the last 5 to 8 years in Iran, for example. And so and that ranges from teachers to steel workers to farm workers. Anyway, I'll just let it go at that.
To follow up on some of my opening remarks on this point, I would say, again, getting back to basics, if you will, the old style Marxism, that Marx and Engels thought, and the first generations of Marxists thought, that after the Industrial Revolution, labor power can only really be bargained for as a commodity. The value of labor power, and therefore the value of time, can only be bargained for collectively. In other words, we've regressed to such a point that we think of the labor contract as like an individual affair. But Marx thought that labor as a commodity isn't really even constituted as a commodity, if not collectively. And so, he saw the reform movements that really come out of liberalism of the early 19th century in Britain, with industrialism, and the working class's increasing participation in that. That collective bargaining is for Marxism really how capitalism itself is constituted. In other words, you don't really have capitalism unless you have a kind of collective negotiation over the value of labor power. And not just within like a firm or within a field, within an industry, but really in society as a whole. So the factory acts, like labor laws, the length of the working day, the social minimum, right? That's really what we're talking about when we talk about the crisis of value. Whereas now we have this kind of like atomized working class. We have atomized workers. Are they a class? In other words, they objectively, we could say, or certainly, sell their labor power. But again, it actually affects the way Marxism originally understood capitalism, looking at conditions today. And also the nationalistic kind of fragmentation of the working class that we just take for granted after the 20th century would not have been so taken for granted in Marx and Engels's and the Second International's own time. The 19th century and the early 20th century. So when, again, when we're thinking about workers lifting their eyes beyond their immediate personal circumstances or their immediate conditions or what you call exploitation, it seems like that happens to a certain degree. And I think Patrick's example, it was Patrick's example or was it Earl's example of the West Virginia teachers who got a 5% raise for the whole state employee force, right? That would be like the beginning of capitalism, right? Like, in other words, that's not the beginning of socialism, that's the beginning of capitalism as like a thing, right? Because then you're talking about kind of social norms, social minimums, social norms, in a way where the working class has a role in it. In other words, where it's not just laws on the books, it's not just OSHA rules or something like that, right? It's not conditions of lawsuits that management has to navigate. But when the working class starts to think of itself as, a class, right? That's what Marxism thought capitalism was, right? They thought that capitalism was constituted by class struggle, in a way that we don't really have very much of that now.
So there's a few questions that are related now, and I'm going to group them together. The one question is from David Mountain, and it's a question for all the panelists. The idea of social justice has become increasingly prevalent amongst broader sections of society, and its meaning is often unclear. As Jamal and Chris perhaps insinuated, in the socialism of the DSA and Momentum, this social justice is often led by the professional managerial class interests. It is not the basis for a revolutionary party. What are the prospects for social justice for a 21st century socialism informed by the history of Marxism? Relatedly, this is from One Tie for Jamal. You spoke about the class composition as you put it, of the American left. Radical activists, professional managerial class, etc., as holding back the left. And Sanders and Corbyn's miscalculation in consolidating precisely this problematic basis. Now that they appear defeated, what theoretical and practical obstacles still remain, preventing a change or expansion in the composition of the left in the terms that you'd find desirable? And then a final question, which is more tangential, but I think Jamal needs to step off earlier than others. So I wanted to try and get an answer from him on this. This is from Audrey Crescenti. For Jamal again. Why should we assume that legal repression of third parties bars the formation of an independent socialist party? Compare that with Seth Ackerman's blueprint for a new party in light of the SPD's massive growth under Bismarck's anti-socialist laws. So sorry, I know that's a lot of questions, but I wanted to make sure we got that all in.
Sure. So with regard to the last one, I don't want to come across as too deterministic about this, and I recognize that I may have sounded a bit too deterministic. I don't think that it's as clear as the electoral system predetermines the sorts of political formations that may or may not emerge. I do think that the electoral system has a very significant effect, though, and I think that there have been political scientists who've done studies on this showing that left parties do better under proportional or ranked preference electoral systems compared to first past the post. And so I think that just insofar as this is something that we've seen in the United States happen over and over again, left parties either unable to emerge from sort of the third party ghetto, or if they do so emerge, they're immediately sort of recaptured by one of the two major parties, generally the Democrats, and they disappear, like the Minnesota Farmer Labor Party and so on and so forth. I think this is something that we should be focusing on a lot. With regard to Wentai's question about the theoretical and practical sort of hurdles or steps that we need to consider in order to clear a space for a working class oriented left, I think that it is very important not to underestimate the extent to which the professional managerial class, particularly under the post-recession sort of economic conditions, is trained and incentivized to be in constant sort of competition for scarce jobs and scarce resources, using the language of identity, using the language of personal sort of grievance, using the manipulation of social norms and so on and so forth to undercut potential economic or social rivals. This is very, very difficult to reconcile with a movement that seeks to have a large working class membership, because members of the working class are not immersed in these kind of environments in their daily jobs.
If they are, they see it as labor discipline.
Right, exactly, right. And it is labor discipline. It's a form of labor discipline that the PMC kind of have internalized and then reproduce. But so basically working class members don't have an immune system when they're confronted with this stuff, right? When someone scolds you for, saying you guys instead of y'all at a meeting, you may not have a sort of language that would allow you to push back against that. And so you may just grow frustrated and you may just leave. And this happens in DSA chapters and in left organizations all over the country, right? Yep. And people have a tendency to sort of poo-poo this as, oh, it's just, you're assuming that the working class is so hypersensitive they can't deal with a little bit of sort of this sort of stuff. And it's like, it's not about sensitivity, right? It's about recognizing that you're competing on a not level playing field and just taking your ball and going home, right? Which is a perfectly rational reaction that anyone would have, right?
They know it's not for them.
Right. I think that
the same thing was true of the Labor Party when we tried to build it in locations.
Yeah. And so, this is a recurring issue, not just on the American left. You see this has been occurring slowly, but, in Die Linke, it's been occurring in the left party in Sweden, from what my friends have told me. So this is an issue that, and obviously the Brahman left thesis that Piketty came up with has been circulating. So this is not news to anyone, but how we pry ourselves out of this, I think, we really have to be purposeful when we're forming some sort of new new party, new formation, whatever, to succeed the DSA and to succeed some of the other, failed left party experiments, we need to be very purposeful that our goal is to attract a working class base, and we need to have safeguards in place to make sure that that is capable of happening, because otherwise, left to your own devices, you're going to get the same kind of mix of hobbyists and people with a lot of time on their hands and people who just really like reading, pseudo-academic jargon and bullying people with it. They're going to come in, they're going to, seize all the levers of power, they're going to seize control of the grievance committees, they're going to seize control of everything, and they're going to start expelling working class people, as happened in some DSA chapters like Pittsburgh. So I think this is a very serious issue. It's not one that many people in the DSA are really sort of cognizant of, because DSA chapters kind of collapsed the singularity of PMC moralist politics very rapidly, and once they do, everyone who kind of has a problem with it goes away. So yeah, I guess I don't really have any clear answers, but I think we have to take this very, very seriously whenever we're forming left formations going forward.
A couple of questions. Unless, does anyone want to speak to any of those issues or respond to Jamal?
I wanted to just, if I could, kind of piggyback off that a little bit, not to pile on too much, but I would say, one of the thoughts that I had coming into this discussion, and not really thinking about my fellow panelists, actually, not thinking about the curation, but thinking about the broader audience for this kind of discussion, socialism in the 21st century. I think that we just take for granted that socialism is some kind of left of the Democratic Party kind of thing. And this speaks to what Jamal is raising as an issue. Meaning, I would say that the issue is not the ballot line and the two-party system and winner takes all, first past the post kind of stuff. That's not really the problem. The problem is that we have a really deeply embedded assumption going back to the 1930s, going back to the FDR New Deal era and the Communist Party's orientation towards FDR and the New Deal, that if you're not a Democrat, I think unconsciously, it's like, if you're not a Democrat, you're a Republican. And therefore, right, that affects the working class too, especially in this post-Reaganite era and also in the Trumpist era that we're living in, which is to say that really people don't have like the headspace for thinking about, you can not be a Democrat and also not be a Republican, right? It's not like, okay, that the first idea is if you denounce the Democrats or criticize the Democrats or say, I'm not a Democrat, then people are like, oh, so you must be a Republican, even if it's just unconscious, that's the assumption. And Jamal raised this earlier about, like Second Amendment issues, right? For instance, I think that socialists would disagree with both parties completely. However, they would find sometimes sympathy with the Republicans and sometimes sympathy with the Democrats, because the Republicans and the Democrats have a division of labor in terms of the way they kind of garner votes and engage in demagogy and make appeals to people. They obviously have to have more support than just the ruling class per se in order to, function, not only to be elected, but also just to function as political forces in society. And so that's one thing that we really, have to also consider, which is, because again, I'm from a working class background. I feel like I kind of instinctively, intuitively know that the working class is not instantly captured by Republican or Democratic Party politics. They vote sometimes, they don't vote a lot of the time. And right, so that's a phenomenon of what Jamal's calling the professional managerial class idea. Because I would say the left is not so much the way it is because they're PMCs. I think that the left is what it is because they're Democrats, and that the Democratic Party is the party of PMCs, actually, right? So I would say that the class aspect of it flows from the political aspect of it. In other words, the politics doesn't flow from the class flows from the politics. which is it's because the left are Democrats that they're members of the professional managerial class. And that includes, by the way, staffers at unions, right? Existing organized labor, staff, not the workers that they organize, but the staff, they're Democrats, and their professional managerial class is what they are. So that's why the left is what it is. It's because they're Democrats.
That's not true for those who would have a revolutionary left.
Say more about that, Earl? Because I agree. Go ahead.
There's a whole different perspective of a revolutionary socialism, which is usually spits on the Democratic Party, doesn't see themselves, and tries to do independent work. Now, I think that's, I don't know how much of it still exists. I know it's doesn't exist that much in my neck of the woods, but there is a whole different perspective. I'm going to see if I can try and put a few things together that make sense. One is, there is a capitalist class. They are conscious of their common interests. They're not just or only driven by capital as dead labor, but they are a class that's aware of their own place in society. They're a class that goes out and puts much effort into controlling the ideas, the examples, the kinds of thinking that is out there. I'm going to assume that many people who are listening to this are familiar with Lewis Powell's memo to the American Chamber of Commerce, I think around 1971, in which he explained to them that the ideas and the values that maintain their class and the relations of their class were under threat from the social and political movements of the radicals, from the women's movement, the black women, etc., black movement, soldiers and workers in the factories and students, that they had to pay attention to that. And he advised them on how to do it, which was largely set up think tanks and control the language and the direction of society. So the recognition of capitalist power as a conscious class in and for itself and of itself is a really important part of the struggle for socialism, because otherwise we are left with the Democratic Party, as you say, Chris. So I think that also sets forth the importance of having an organization that's founded on the recognition that this is a war and that they have a side and they're conscious of it and they have tools. And for example, the naval commander of the Theodore Roosevelt atomic-powered, nuclear-powered aircraft carrier now in Guam, where the commander wrote a 4-page letter to the higher officers, which was then spread around, in which he called for his mission to be truncated and for his crew to be able to be put into quarantine because there were 100 cases of the virus on ship of 5,000 people. And he was fired for his troubles. And initially, the higher-ups in the Navy said that they had to continue with their mission. And they must have gotten a lot of feedback, because then they backed off of that. My point being that there are class contradictions that exist, that there are conscious elements, that there's divisions within them. And a revolutionary organization would develop this kind of work and consciousness and see where it's possible to have actual interventions, because this is something that affected potentially 5,000 sailors' lives, and most of them were working class people. They were not bosses, they were not commanders, they weren't lieutenant commanders, they were ordinary
enlisted.
Exactly. And the recognition that class struggle takes place essentially everywhere where there's conflict in society is the fundamental feature of any revolutionary socialist group that wants to help develop our class awareness and the capabilities that exist within the working class itself.
I think I have to drop off, guys, but it's been a great conversation, and I hope you guys continue it. Thanks so much for inviting me, and good to talk to you both, Chris and Earl.
Thanks, Jamal. Take care.
Thanks for participating. Helps me.
So there's a couple of questions about, like, what are the obstacles facing those who wish to reconstitute a mass revolutionary socialist party? So one comes from Ed Remus. So he asks, one of the obstacles is the existing discontinuity between the historic and contemporary left, not only at the level of consciousness, but also at the level of organization. If proletarian socialism is to have any future in the 21st century, how could or would it learn to organize society? And a second question from Danny Jacobs to all the panelists is, what do you think is a bigger obstacle in the present to the formation of a mass socialist party and the potentially slow but steady march, sorry, this is a strangely worded question, so let me back up a second. And the potentially slow but steady march to a socialist revolution and the attainment of socialism. So what do you think is the biggest obstacle? Not a bigger, sorry about that.
God. Why don't you ask a little question?
Yeah, you gotta save this for last, right? Oh my God.
Yeah.
Let me say something just quickly, because I wanted to maybe respond to something that Earl said much earlier, which is, you know, the kind of ongoing crisis, you know, in various dimensions that capitalism faces, right? It faces value crises, both large and small, both long cycle and short cycle. It obviously, climate change, you know, it can be understood as a crisis of capitalism as well. Therefore, you know, revolutionary possibilities, opportunities, and the, you know, serving as a midwife for revolution, right? So I think that it came up earlier in our convention on a previous panel that we had on environmentalism. Was that on Thursday?
Yes.
Was that a couple of days ago? Yeah.
Yes.
And basically, the discussion there, I think the Christian Parenti raised the issue of revolution. And I don't know if Earl, if you said this or someone else said it, about that it's not about whether revolutionaries want the revolution or not, right? In other words, it doesn't come down to whether, you know, whether we should want revolution or not, right? And so I think that that's true. In other words, I think that capitalism produces the revolution. In other words, it's capitalism's own problems and own contradiction and crises that produce revolutionary situations that disrupt society and politics, and you know, create, I would say, opportunities, possibilities, but really produce calamities and catastrophes. And capitalism will continue to do such. We'll continue to make the revolution, if you will. The only question, therefore, is whether there's something to meet it. In other words, whether the revolution can be made good, or whether it just is a cycle of capitalism, just a you know, a revolution of capital, if you will. And so that's where I feel like these questions come from. In other words, what's the obstacle to building that force, to building that political instrument, the midwife, right? That will not have the possibility of moving beyond capitalism be thwarted in the crisis that will inevitably take place and recurs. And I think that that's, you know, again, like as Earl just commented, that's a big question. And of course, it's hard for me to not address the accumulated obstacle, meaning socialism in the 21st century, the topic of our discussion today, is really staring down the 20th century, meaning it's not like, what's the biggest obstacle? It's like, well, what's the nature of the obstacle, if you will? And I think the nature of the obstacle is the accumulated obstacles or accumulated problems that history has left us over the course of the past 100 years. And so there are a lot of kind of characteristic thought figures. I would say there's kind of dogmatism and certain taboos that are there. And of course, this is why Platypus exists, right? Platypus exists to help us become aware of these things that are otherwise kind of just in the background and taken for granted. Because, you know, like Jamal was talking about the professional managerial class. Another way of thinking about it is that socialists right now, or the left, is consigned, kind of relegated to what we would call intellectuals, right? In other words, even if they're working class people, these are people who are concerning themselves with more kind of, ideological questions and, political visions that are really more of an intellectual exercise at this point. And there are a lot of kind of mental inhibitions against the kind of struggle that has to take place. And I mentioned earlier, right, one strong mental inhibition is, well, if you're not a Democrat, then you must be a Republican, right? Like, in other words, that there's this kind of ideological polarization, what Marxists used to call false polarization. There's false polarization at an ideological level that socialists have to be independent from and cut across and really try to break out of. And so obviously that's, because I've been doing Platypus for a while and I'm one of the, kind of historic leaders of Platypus, like obviously I would emphasize that aspect of things. Because otherwise I think that at an organizational level, of course there are difficulties, it's a difficult task, but I don't think that there are kind of objective social obstacles to organizing. In many ways, there's a wide open field. There's a wide open field, and a lot of the problem has to do with the blinders that we have, that we can't see just how open the field really is because of our characteristic habits of thinking about things in a certain way. We don't see just how open the field actually is.
I actually agree with that last conclusion very much. It makes me crazy to see how wide open the field is and that nobody's working the field, it seems like.
Exactly.
But I do think, obviously I'm not in Platypus and I haven't been in a reading group for 14 years or 13 years, whatever it was, Chris. But I think what appears to be the total emphasis on explaining the failures of the past is not matched by attempts to put into practice those lessons for what is a positive path, if you will. If this is no good for this reason, and this is no good for this reason, then where do dialectics come in here? Or where is the materialist conception of history helpful to actual organizing around daily life issues? Whether it's climate change, or which I think is a daily life issue, it's just not seen that way by a lot of people, or the pending cuts in whatever. Let me think. I think we don't pay enough attention to some of the very concrete things that are going on, that are tremendous organizing opportunities, even though they have difficulties, and being purely negative seems to me either
limited.
No, I would say it's a waste of time.
Oh, okay.
Because, and here's where you'll appreciate how crude Maoists can be. Mao was explaining the level of the Chinese intellectuals under the old regime. And he said, they are worth less than the camel's dung. Because camel shit was useful in fertilizing the fields. But intellectuals separated from the practice and the realities of working class life are worthless and an obstacle, because all you can do is say, why this is no good, and this is no good, and this is no good. So why is it that you can't point to some actual organizing work where you're developing class consciousness and confidence and the intellectual background and capacity of working class intellectuals?
That's fair. That's fair. I mean, I would say that.
You know me, Chris, I'm always fair.
Yeah,
I'm trying to be.
Yeah, Platypus, I guess, I'll just say this, which is, I think that we always had a very modest ambition to serve a rather limited role. We didn't think that we were going to be the path forward. The via negativa, the negative aspect, was a self-limitation. And in the last few years, and it hasn't It's unfortunately all the oxygen in the room has been taken up by Bernie and the DSA, but I have attempted something else, the Campaign for a Socialist Party, which is very different from Platypus, and is but again, we were ensnared by the tide of anti-Trumpism and the inevitable drift towards Democratic Party politics of the DSA.
Yeah.
And, so before Bernie declared and before Trump declared, I had this idea that Hillary would be the next president, and that this would mean that there would be this huge untapped space for organizing.
Yeah.
Right?
If I could add something, Chris?
Yeah.
My generation radicalized because liberal Democrats ran the government.
Yeah.
So therefore we had to go left.
There was nowhere else to go. Right.
There was nowhere else to go.
That's right. Yeah. And I was, rather naively now, I think, in early 2015, I thought, okay, so we're in this kind of a, we're in this kind of a period, and this would be a good time to try to, take advantage of that opening, of that open field. Unfortunately, then it wasn't an open field, and everything's been tied back to the Democrats through anti-Trumpism. And there's part of me that I was hoping, obviously the coronavirus, crisis is obviously upon us right now. But I was actually hoping for the Trump boom, because I also think that boom periods are good periods for organizing.
Boom in the sense of lots of jobs and people feeling comfortable and having some comfort so they could take a step up.
Yep. So I was looking ahead to that too, and that's stuff. I actually think that there's reason to believe that the next period will be different from the 2000s and 2010s. And I always thought, going back to the Labor Party experience with Adolph Reed, I thought I had my own criticisms of the Labor Party initiative of the 90s. But I also thought the 90s, because they were a boom era, was a propitious time to try to do something like that, actually.
And the main obstacle was the conservatism of the unions, who put money and staff into the effort and worked to actually choke the life out of their organization rather than let us take off on campaigning, running our own candidates, campaigning for health care, campaigning for minimum wage. They did not want to do any challenge to the Democrats.
Yeah.
None.
Yeah.
Which was mostly organizationally, it was the CP and the SP, but there were plenty of others. Anyway.
Anyway. So maybe that could still happen. In other words, maybe free of this plague, hopefully, there will still be opportunities. So I'm not only interested, in just talking about everything that's wrong with the left, but I still think that Platypus has a useful function to play, which is to, help students who are interested in the left to not get sucked into the usual grooves of, I guess now the sectarian left is more absent, but what I would call the fringe of the Democratic Party, to see, that drift, to recognize that tide that drags things in that direction. But it's a limited purpose. I think it's an important purpose, but it's not the whole picture, of course.
So Patrick, we're kind of approaching kind of concluding remarks, I suppose. And Chris and Earl were just responding to the question of what are some of the biggest obstacles to building a mass socialist party. So if you want to jump in on that, I know you've been having some technical difficulties, but I want to give you an opportunity to kind of respond to that question and present some concluding remarks on the discussion tonight.
Patrick?
Yes, I'm here. Probably can't hear me, right?
No, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, I think that the problems today is that there are no viable alternatives that are evident. And that means that one has to deal with what seems to be evident. And that what is evident essentially is reformism, an attempt to reform capitalism and to make it more humane. That there is not an alternative at this juncture to capitalism as a system. And that's really what's needed. There is a tremendous sentiment that capitalism is broke. It's not delivering its goods. This is not really the case as evidenced during the coronavirus. But I think that in the coming period, there has to be evidenced a possibility that an alternative system is, in fact, possible.
So, did Chris and Earl, do you want to take a moment to provide some concluding remarks as well? Earl? I think you might be muted, Earl.
Okay, well, I would just say, you know, obviously, again, this would be by way of a limitation. Nonetheless, I think that the sense of possibility that we have is not going to be found in things like the pink tide in Latin America, or, you know, clearly in the last few years, we've had phenomena like SYRIZA in Greece and Podemos in Spain, the Jeremy Corbyn leadership of the Labour Party, the momentum movement around that, the Bernie Sanders campaign. That sense of a possibility of an alternative, I think, is misleading. And so, again, I will admit that this is rather limited. Nonetheless, I would say that the sense of possibility that we have now comes from history, comes from a rediscovery of what is otherwise a really lost history. And that does speak to the mission of Platypus, which is to free that history from its falsification, namely the deep history of Marxism, the deep history of socialism and of communism, that is otherwise distorted and misremembered and falsified. Because I don't think that the world is going to furnish us with proof that there really is an alternative to capitalism. I think that only history, the struggles of the past, can offer us that kind of inspiration at this point. In other words, the unfulfilled tasks of the past, the unrealized potential of history, that still haunts us. In other words, my experience with the millennial left, trying to teach the millennial left and continuing to teach younger people, is that there is a genuine curiosity about history that the present still motivates. In other words, people are still driven back to think about, well, was it always this way? Did people always accept things this way? What was it that Marxism wanted again? You know, that does return, that the specter of Marxism returns. And that might seem like a rather thin and Spartan basis for reconstituting a left, but it seems to do so spontaneously. It seems to do so anyway. And I think that the challenge, therefore, is to free it of its falsification in the present. You don't need Marx to justify progressive capitalism a la Bernie Sanders, and yet people kind of marry the authentic, genuine curiosity they have about history to rather in some ways more desperately hopeless ambition of transforming the Democratic Party into something that it's not going to be. It's not even going to be a progressive capitalist party the way it once was.
So if the other panelists don't have anything else to add, I think we could take this moment to thank the panelists for...
Did I get a chance to summarize, or?
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, we
okay.
tried to turn to you. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I think Patrick is right and Chris is right, because there is more anti-capitalist sentiment and curiosity and questioning now than at the height of the 60s. At the height of the 60s, usually the best we could do was to raise the understanding or the idea that America is an imperialist power. This is not a mistake. These are not bad people. It's the system. But to engage people at today's level of questioning and criticism of capitalism as a system did not exist. You couldn't have gotten poll results that say a plurality of African Americans, a plurality of people under 35 would pick capitalism over socialism. No way, never, wasn't going to happen. There's more now, and therefore there are more opportunities now. The only thing I think, and this is a criticism of something that Chris said earlier, but I think it's really important, is this engaging the I forget what you called it, Chris, the liberal illusion, if you will. And everything has to be an alternative. If you're not for this, you're helping Trump or something like that. And everything has to revolve around it. I have dear friends from 60 years ago who beat me about the head and the shoulders with this shit all the time. So it's very real. There's more anti-capitalist sentiment. Social democracy does not end exploitation. In my understanding and my experience, exploitation can exist in a social democratic arrangements because labor, we're still selling our capacity to labor, and there's accumulation of capital based on that. That's an abstract question, maybe, but the reality, I think the emphasis, what we didn't understand in my section of the left, we had no understanding of what dialectical materialism was about, what dialectics meant. The fact that the answer lies in the problem and arises out of the resolving of the problem, we could barely pay lip service to. To understand that the working class is not just potentially a fighting class, but a revolutionary class, that to free ourselves from the system of exploitation means ending everybody's oppression and exploitation. That can excite people. And I think that should be a key part of our message. That's all.
All right, well, I want to take this opportunity to thank the panelists for participating in the discussion tonight. And unfortunately, we're virtual, so I'm sure that if we were in person, there'd be a moment to have some applause. But again, I want to thank you all for taking part in this discussion of our international convention. So I also want to remind everyone that there will be a post-panel discussion, and I've shared a link to that on the chat. And I also want to remind everyone that if you have a response to anything that you heard tonight, and we didn't get a chance to get to your questions in the Q&A, or you had more questions, or you had more thoughts, we want to encourage you to submit to the Platypus Review, and you can do so by emailing editor@platypus1917.org. And along a similar line, if you want to join an online reading group, you can join through the platypus1917.org virtual link, which I've included on the chat as well. So feel free to come check out that. Feel free to submit to the Platypus Review. And again, I thank everyone for coming out. Well, not coming out, but logging on. So thanks.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.